The twilight cast long shadows across the gleaming spires of Vixara capital of the Vexaran kingdom, as diplomats and nobility gathered for what was being heralded as the most significant interspecies reception in a generation. Holographic banners bearing the insignias of both Earth and Vexara rippled in the artificial breeze, their colors merging in symbolic unity above the grand embassy courtyard. George Sullivan adjusted his formal attire with practiced precision, years of military discipline evident in his movements despite the unfamiliar civilian garb. The midnight blue diplomatic uniform felt confining after years in tactical gear, but he supposed that was the point to remind him of his new role. Security advisor to the Earth ambassador wasn't the career path he'd imagined for himself 3 years ago, but then again, he hadn't imagined being dishonorably discharged either. "Remember, Sullivan," Ambassador Hayes muttered beside him as they approached the gleaming crystalline entrance of the reception hall. "You're here to observe and advise, not to engage." George nodded curtly. "Yes, sir. Observe and advise. I understand my position." Hayes cast him a sidelong glance. "Do you? Because the last advisor, I had nearly caused an interplanetary incident by attempting to search a Vexaran noble for weapons. With respect, sir, I'm not that green. I've studied their customs extensively." George kept his voice steady, unwilling to reveal just how deeply he'd immersed himself in Vexaran culture over the past months. Knowledge was survival in unfamiliar territory, a lesson hard-learned during his Special Forces days. The ambassador seemed unconvinced, but nodded anyway. "See that you remember. The Vexarans take protocol very seriously. One misstep and—" His words died away as they entered the grand hall, the sheer scale of the space momentarily stealing their breath. Curved walls of polished obsidian rose 3 stories high, inlaid with veins of luminescent minerals that traced ancient Vexaran constellations. Diplomats from a dozen worlds mingled beneath floating spheres of light, their conversations forming a symphony of languages that the translation implants in George's ear struggled to process simultaneously. But it wasn't the architecture or the diverse gathering that caused conversation to falter throughout the hall. It was the arrival of Princess Alatha, first daughter of the succession. She entered from the far side of the hall, her entourage of royal guards forming a precise formation around her. Unlike the elaborate flowing garments worn by most Vexaran nobility, the princess wore a fitted ensemble that blended ceremonial robes with elements of light armor, a statement that did not go unnoticed by the gathering. Traditional, yet practical. Royal, yet ready for battle. "That's unusual," George murmured more to himself than the ambassador. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "The armor. The combination. She's making a statement." George observed the way the guards positioned themselves, not in the ceremonial pattern described in the briefing materials, but in a true defensive formation. "She's expecting trouble." Ambassador Hayes frowned. "How can you possibly know that—" George didn't answer, his attention fixed on the subtle differences between what he was seeing and what protocol dictated should be happening. The princess moved with deliberate grace through the gathering, her iridescent skin catching the light in hypnotic patterns. Unlike other Vexarans, whose skin displayed simple geometric patterns, the royal family bore intricate swirling designs that seemed to shift and change with their emotions. Currently, the markings along Alatha's exposed arms pulsed with a steady, cautious blue. As the princess made her way toward the central dais, where Earth representatives waited alongside other important dignitaries, George noticed a servant approaching with refreshments. Something about the server's movements triggered an alarm in his mind, a subtle irregularity in gait that his combat-trained senses couldn't ignore. The servant was moving too purposefully, eyes tracking the princess too intently. George slipped away from the ambassador without a word, circling around the edge of the gathering to approach from a different angle. Years of training had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now every nerve in his body was screaming danger. The princess had reached the antechamber, leading to the dais, momentarily separated from most of her guard, as protocol demanded she approach the allied dignitaries with a show of trust. The servant moved with sudden speed, cutting through the crowd with unnatural precision. George saw the glint of metal as the servant reached into his tray, fingers closing around something that was decidedly not a refreshment. Time slowed to a crawl as training took over. George had crossed half the distance already, but he wouldn't reach the assassin before they struck. Instead, he altered his trajectory, muscles coiling as he launched himself toward the princess. Princess Alatha turned at the commotion, her eyes widening as she registered both threats simultaneously, the blade arcing toward her and the human diplomat hurtling through the air. Her guards were already moving, but too late. The assassin's blade descended as George collided with the princess, twisting mid-air to place his body between her and the weapon. White-hot pain exploded across his back as the ceremonial dagger designed to penetrate Vexaran armor sliced through his diplomatic uniform and deep into flesh. They crashed to the ground, George instinctively rolling to keep his weight from crushing the smaller Vexaran royal. Chaos erupted around them. Guards swarmed the assassin, who was already convulsing poison in their bloodstream, a standard suicide protocol for hired killers. Ambassador Hayes was shouting something unintelligible, but all George could focus on was the princess staring up at him with an expression of absolute shock, her skin patterns swirling with colors he hadn't seen before. "You," she whispered in perfect English, her multi-tone voice carrying despite the chaos. "You have initiated Thiazi." The pain in George's back intensified, but it was nothing compared to the sudden wave of dizziness that washed over him at her words. Thiazi, the blood debt tradition. He'd read about it in restricted cultural briefings, but never imagined. "Your Highness," he managed through gritted teeth. "I was just doing my job." Princess Alatha's expression shifted to something unreadable as the royal guards finally reached them, pulling George away with more gentleness than he expected. The last thing he saw before unconsciousness claimed him was the princess rising to her feet, her skin now pulsing with deep crimson determination as she barked orders in her native tongue. "Take him to the palace healing chambers," she commanded. "By royal decree, this human is now under my protection, as Thiazi bound. Any who interfere answer directly to me." George awoke to an unfamiliar ceiling of polished stone, veined with the same luminescent minerals he'd seen in the reception hall. He tried to sit up, only to be firmly pressed back down by a blue energy field that hummed with subtle vibration. "The healing membrane must complete its work," came a melodic voice from somewhere to his left. "Movement disrupts the process." Turning his head, the only movement apparently permitted, George found Princess Alatha seated beside his bed. Gone was the ceremonial armor from the reception. Instead, she wore simpler attire that reminded him of medical scrubs, though clearly of royal quality. Her skin patterns had settled into a calm, flowing azure. "Your Highness," George acknowledged, his voice rougher than he expected. "How long was I out?" "3 rotations," she replied, which his mental calculation converted to roughly 30 Earth hours. The assassin's blade carried a neurotoxin designed for Vexaran physiology. Our healers were uncertain of its effects on human biology. Yet here I am. A smile ghosted across her lips. "Indeed, your species' adaptability continues to impress our medical practitioners." They fell into silence, the princess studying him with an intensity that made George uncomfortably aware of his position, wounded, restricted, and completely at the mercy of alien royalty. Not exactly how he'd planned to spend his first diplomatic mission. "Your Ambassador Hayes has been quite insistent on seeing you," Alatha finally said. "He seems concerned that we might be holding you against your will."
"Are you—"
The princess's skin patterns flickered briefly with what George recognized as amusement. "You saved my life, George Sullivan. Under Vexaran law and tradition, harming you would be equivalent to harming myself." "Thiazi," George said. "The blood debt." Surprise registered in her expression. "You know of this?" "I studied your culture extensively before this assignment, though I admit the classified briefings were sparse on details." Alatha leaned forward slightly. Then you understand the significance of what has transpired between us. George hesitated. I understand the basics. By taking a wound meant for you, I've initiated some kind of sacred bond. But the particulars are complex and binding, she finished for him. A life debt in the royal family is not simply a matter of gratitude, Mr. Sullivan. It is a spiritual and legal connection that cannot be severed except through death. She paused, studying his reaction. This presents certain complications for your diplomatic mission. Before George could respond, the healing membrane above him shimmered and dissipated. The princess rose gracefully. The physicians will want to examine you now that the membrane has completed its work. Afterward, we must speak more of what lies ahead. She moved toward the door, then paused. I have informed your ambassador that you will be remaining in the palace as my cultural advisor. Your what? George pushed himself up on his elbows, wincing as healing skin pulled tight across his back. My cultural advisor, she repeated with what might have been the Vexarin equivalent of a smirk. It was the most diplomatic way to explain your new position without causing an interplanetary incident. After all, we can hardly explain to your government that you are now bound to me through an ancient blood ritual. With that, she was gone, leaving George to wonder exactly what he'd gotten himself into by following his instincts. One split-second decision, and he'd somehow become entangled in alien royal politics through a mystical bond he barely understood. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical examinations, during which George learned that the assassination attempt had been just one of several coordinated attacks throughout the capital. 2 minor nobles aligned with the princess's progressive faction had been killed, and another wounded evidence of a conspiracy, rather than an isolated incident. By the time he was finally left alone, night had fallen over Vixara. Through the high windows of his healing chamber, he could see 3 of Vixara's moons, casting prismatic light across the city's crystalline architecture. The door slid open, admitting Ambassador Hayes, whose rumpled appearance suggested he'd been awake for most of the time George had been unconscious. Sullivan, he acknowledged with visible relief. Good to see you, Vertical. Sir. George nodded carefully, adjusting the loose Vexarin healing garments he'd been provided. I apologize for the disruption to the mission. Hayes barked a short laugh. Disruption. That's putting it mildly. You've managed to become entangled in some kind of alien blood pact with the heir to the Vexarin throne. He ran a hand over his face. Central Command is having conniptions trying to determine if this constitutes a breach of diplomatic protocol. With respect, sir, I was preventing an assassination. No one's questioning your actions, Sullivan. Just dealing with the consequences. Hayes lowered his voice. This Thiaci business, the princess is insisting you remain here under her protection. Says it's non-negotiable under Vexarin law. George nodded slowly. She mentioned something similar. The question is, what's your take on this? Are you being coerced? Do we need to negotiate for your release? The question gave George pause. Was he being coerced? Technically, yes. He hadn't asked to be bound by alien traditions. And yet, I believe the princess's concerns are legitimate, sir. If this Thiaci bond is as significant as it appears, my removal could cause diplomatic harm. He chose his words carefully. Additionally, remaining close to the royal family could provide valuable intelligence regarding the current political situation. Hayes studied him for a long moment. You're suggesting we use this as an opportunity. I'm suggesting we respect their customs while gaining insight into the assassination attempts. If there's internal strife that could affect Earth-Vexarin relations, we should know about it. The ambassador seemed to weigh this logic, then nodded reluctantly. Very well. I'll inform Central Command that you're accepting this cultural advisor position temporarily. He fixed George with a stern look. But I want regular reports, Sullivan. And at the first sign this arrangement is being used to manipulate Earth policy, we extract you, Thiaci be damned. Understood, sir. After Hayes departed, George found himself once again alone with his thoughts. The healing chamber, while comfortable, was clearly designed for short-term medical recovery rather than extended stays. If he was to remain in the palace, arrangements would need to be made. As if summoned by his thoughts, Captain Garroth, commander of the princess's personal guard, appeared at the doorway. The Vexaran military officer's skin bore the angular patterns of the warrior caste, accentuated by ceremonial scarification that marked his rank. Human Sullivan. He greeted with the barest minimum of courtesy. The princess requests your presence in the royal apartments, if you are able to move. George carefully stood, testing his healing wound. I can manage. The captain made no move to assist him, instead, watching with barely concealed suspicion as George followed him into the corridor. Two guards fell into step behind them as they navigated the labyrinthine palace hallways. You should know, Garroth said without turning, that many in the court view this Thiassi bond with skepticism. It is unprecedented with an off-worlder. I didn't exactly plan for it to happen, Captain. Yet it did, conveniently placing a human in the inner circle of the first daughter at a time of political instability. The captain's tone left little doubt about his suspicions. They passed through a series of security checkpoints, each more elaborate than the last, until they reached a towering door carved from what appeared to be a single massive gemstone. It slid open at Garroth's approach, revealing a spacious antechamber decorated with historical tapestries and ceremonial weapons. Princess Alatha awaited them now, dressed in more formal attire that marked her royal status, while still maintaining the practical elements that seemed to be her preference. Standing behind her was an elderly Vexaran female whose elaborate facial markings identified her as a high priestess. Mr. Sullivan, the princess acknowledged. I trust you are healing well. Yes, Your Highness. Your medical technology is impressive. I am pleased to hear it, she gestured to the elderly Vexaran. This is Priestess Sirona, keeper of the ancient ways and expert in the traditions of Thiassi. She will guide us through what must come next. The priestess stepped forward, her movements deliberate and ceremonial. Human Sullivan, do you understand that the bond you have initiated is sacred under our laws, that it cannot be broken by distance diplomacy or decree? George met her gaze steadily. I'm beginning to grasp its significance, priestess. Sirona nodded, seemingly satisfied with his answer. Then you must also understand that Thiassi with royalty follows specific protocols. The first stage, proximity, must begin immediately. Proximity. George glanced at the princess, who appeared unusually interested in a distant tapestry. You must reside within the royal apartments, the priestess explained, in the chamber adjoining the princess's personal quarters. Captain Garroth made a sound that might have been a suppressed objection, but fell silent at a glance from Alatha. Is that appropriate? George asked carefully. The priestess's skin patterns shifted to what George recognized as the equivalent of a raised eyebrow. It is not a matter of appropriateness, but necessity. The Thiassi bond requires proximity to stabilize during its initial formation. Separation beyond certain distances can cause physical distress to both parties. George looked to the princess for confirmation, and she nodded slightly. The symptoms begin with discomfort, Alatha explained, but can progress to pain and eventually physical collapse if the bond is strained too far too soon. After the initial stage is complete, greater distances become possible, though never without consequence. I see. George considered the implications. Living in the royal apartments would place him at the center of Vexaran political life, and potentially at the center of whatever conspiracy had targeted the princess. And how long does this proximity stage last? That depends on the individuals involved, Priestess Sirona replied. The bond will make its needs known. Something in her tone suggested this was deliberately vague, but before George could press for clarification, the princess spoke. Your belongings have already been transferred from the embassy, and Captain Garroth's security team has cleared the chambers for your use. She gestured toward a door on the far side of the antechamber. The second stage will begin once Priestess Sirona determines we have stabilized sufficiently in proximity. The briskness of these arrangements left George somewhat off balance, but years of adapting to changing mission parameters had taught him to roll with unexpected developments. If his new position gave him insight into the assassination attempts and Vexaran politics, it served both his immediate survival and Earth's diplomatic interests. "Very well, Your Highness." He acquiesced with a slight bow that he'd studied from cultural materials. "I look forward to fulfilling my duties as your cultural advisor." A flicker of what might have been amusement crossed Alatha's features. "Indeed. We begin tomorrow with a council meeting regarding recent security measures. Your perspective will be illuminating." With that, George was shown to his new quarters, a spacious suite that, true to the priestess's words, connected directly to the princess's apartments through an ornate, shared anteroom. The accommodations were clearly designed for a high-ranking Vexaran, with adjustments hastily made for human physiology, including modified furniture and environmental controls. As he examined his new living space, George couldn't help but reflect on the bizarre turn of events. 3 days ago, he had been a disgraced former Special Forces operative, relegated to a symbolic security position. Now he was bound by mystical alien tradition to a princess living in the royal palace and potentially at the center of a political conspiracy. And somewhere out there, whoever had orchestrated the assassination attempt was likely already planning their next move. The following weeks established a rhythm that George wouldn't have believed possible before arriving on Vixara. Each morning began with him accompanying Princess Alatha to various diplomatic functions and council meetings where his presence was explained away as a cultural exchange initiative. Afternoons often involved security briefings with Captain Garoth, who maintained his suspicion but had grudgingly begun to acknowledge George's tactical insights. The assassination attempts had ceased for the moment, but intelligence suggested the threat remained. 3 factions had emerged in George's analysis: the traditionalists who opposed any alliance with Earth, the progressives who supported the princess's modernization efforts, and a smaller, more radical group that seemed to advocate for complete isolation from all other species. Throughout it all, George remained acutely aware of the Thiassi bond that Priestess Sirona monitored with regular visits. The proximity requirement proved to be literal when George ventured too far from the princess during a security assessment of the outer palace grounds. Both of them experienced a steadily increasing discomfort that only abated when they returned to an acceptable distance. "It is progressing as expected," Sirona had commented after one such episode. "The bond grows stronger, more stable." What she didn't explain, and what George was beginning to suspect, was that the Thiassi involved more than just physical proximity. He found himself increasingly attuned to the princess's moods, able to sense shifts in her emotional state through subtle changes in her skin patterns that even Captain Garoth sometimes missed. Similarly, Alatha seemed to develop an uncanny awareness of his presence, often addressing him without turning to look when he entered a room. On the 20th day of his residence in the palace, George was summoned to the Temple of Ancestors, a sacred space within the royal complex that few off-worlders had ever entered. He arrived to find Princess Alatha and Priestess Sirona waiting in a circular chamber illuminated by shifting light that seemed to emanate from the stone itself. "We are ready to progress to the second stage of Thiassi," Sirona announced without preamble. The truth-sharing. George had read enough about Vexaran customs to feel a flutter of apprehension. Truth-sharing. Alatha's skin patterns showed similar concern, though she maintained royal composure. "It is a sacred ritual of mutual revelation. Thiassi cannot progress without complete honesty between the bonded. The proximity has stabilized the physical connection," Sirona explained, gesturing for them to sit on ceremonial cushions, arranged at the center of the chamber. "Now, the spiritual and mental connection must be strengthened through truth." George hesitated. His past contained classified operations, state secrets, and personal traumas he'd never shared with anyone. "Some truths might conflict with my oath to Earth's government." The priestess nodded, as if she'd anticipated this objection. "The ritual does not compel specific revelations, Human Sullivan. It requires only that what you choose to share be absolutely true. The depth and nature of the truths are for you to determine, though shallow revelations result in a shallow bond. With that ambiguous reassurance, she instructed them to sit facing each other. A ceremonial brazier was lit between them, releasing a sweet-smelling smoke that didn't seem to affect George's consciousness, but rather sharpened his focus on the princess, seated across from him. "I will leave you to the ritual," Sirona said, retreating to the edge of the chamber. "The ancestors will witness your truths." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Alatha's skin pattern shifted through colors that George had learned to associate with uncertainty before settling into a resolved indigo. "I will begin," she said finally. "It is tradition for the one who received the life-saving to offer the first truth." She took a deep breath. "I am not merely advocating for modernization and alliance with Earth out of progressive principles. I seek to break the power of the ancient houses because I believe my brother Prince Zeth is corrupt and would lead our people to ruin if he succeeds to the throne." The bluntness of this revelation startled George. This wasn't diplomatic posturing or vague allusion. This was direct accusation of the second child of succession, the princess's main competitor for the throne. "That's a significant truth to begin with," he managed. A wry smile touched her lips. "Thiassi doesn't benefit from half measures, George Sullivan." She used his full name with deliberate formality. "Now you must offer a truth of equal weight." Equal weight. George considered what that might mean in this context. Political, personal. After a moment's reflection, he decided to match her revelation's nature. "My dishonorable discharge from Earth's Special Forces wasn't for insubordination as the official record states," he said quietly. "I disobeyed a direct order because I discovered my commanding officer was selling classified intelligence to hostile governments. When I confronted him, he arranged for me to take the fall." Alatha's skin patterns registered surprise, then a deep empathy that transcended species differences. "You were punished for acting with honor." "I was punished for breaking the chain of command," George corrected, though her understanding eased something that had been tight in his chest for years. "My superior had political connections I couldn't overcome. Yet you continue to serve Earth faithfully despite this injustice." It wasn't a question, but George nodded anyway. "I believe in what we're trying to build here. Cooperation between our peoples has potential beyond politics." The ritual continued for hours, truth following truth, in increasing intimacy. George learned of Alatha's isolated childhood, trained from birth for succession, yet kept separate from her people by ancient tradition. She learned of his career in special forces, the missions that had shaped him, and the loneliness that came with a life of service. By the time Priestess Sirona returned, the air between them had transformed, charged with mutual understanding that went beyond mere knowledge of facts. George felt as though he could read volumes in the smallest shifts of Alatha's skin patterns, while she seemed equally attuned to the micro-expressions he usually kept carefully controlled. "The second stage is complete," Sirona announced, studying them both with evident satisfaction. "The bond has deepened, as intended." As they left the temple, George felt simultaneously exhausted and strangely invigorated. The Thiassi bond hummed between them with new resonance, not a physical sensation exactly, but an awareness that couldn't be ignored. "What comes next?" he asked, as they walked through the palace corridors, their guards maintaining a respectful distance. Alatha's expression grew solemn. "The third stage is mutual protection and emotional confluence. It typically manifests in moments of crisis." A wry smile touched her lips. "Given recent events, I suspect we won't have to wait long." Her prediction proved prophetic, sooner than either expected. That very night, as George reviewed security protocols in his chambers, an urgent alert sounded throughout the royal apartments. He rushed to the shared anteroom to find Captain Gareth already briefing the princess. "The ancestral retreat has been compromised," the captain reported grimly. "Explosives have been detected in the lower chambers, set to detonate during tomorrow's memorial observance." George recognized the significance immediately. The ancestral retreat was a sacred site where the royal family communed with the spirits of their predecessors, a ceremony that occurred only once per stellar cycle. All succession candidates would be present along with the current monarch and the High Council. If successful, it would decapitate our entire government, Olathe said, her skin patterns pulsing with controlled alarm. Evacuation orders, George asked. Captain Gareth shook his head. We cannot risk alerting the perpetrators. They may have contingencies if the primary plan fails. We need a small team, George said, military training taking over. Enter quietly, locate and neutralize the devices, then secure evidence to identify who's responsible. Olathe nodded sharply. Gareth, assemble your most trusted operatives. No official channels, we don't know how far the conspiracy reaches. The captain hesitated. Your Highness, protocol dictates you remain secure in the palace while... I will be joining the mission, she interrupted, her tone, brooking no argument. As will Sullivan. Your Highness? The Thiassi bond requires it, Captain, she said, playing the cultural trump card that even Gareth couldn't override. And my brother will be at the retreat for pre-ceremony preparations. I must know if he is involved. George understood her reasoning, even if he shared Gareth's concern about placing the princess in danger. The captain eventually acquiesced, though his skin patterns displayed clear disapproval as he departed to make arrangements. You understand the risk, George said, once they were alone. Olathe met his gaze steadily. Better than most. But this isn't merely about politics, George. The ancestral retreat is our most sacred site, a direct connection to our history and spirituality. Its desecration would wound our people's soul. He nodded, recognizing the conviction in her voice. Then we'll need better equipment than ceremonial daggers. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. My personal armory contains more practical options. Within 2 hours, a small team had assembled in a rarely used service tunnel beneath the palace. Besides George Olathe and Captain Gareth, there were 4 royal guards of unquestionable loyalty, and to George's surprise, a slight Vexaran female, introduced only as Kira, whose simple clothing and lack of formal markings contrasted sharply with the others. Resistance fighter, Olathe explained quietly as they prepared. From the northern provinces where traditionalists have enforced the old ways, most harshly. She knows explosives better than anyone in the capital. The ancestral retreat lay 10 kilometers beyond the city's edge, nestled in a densely forested region, accessible only by a single ceremonial path, or as their current plan dictated, through the emergency ventilation system installed during recent modernization efforts that Prince Zeth had vehemently opposed. They traveled in 2 unmarked vehicles designed for forest terrain, maintaining communication silence until they reached the perimeter of the sacred grounds. There, they abandoned the vehicles and continued on foot using the cover of Vexara's largest moon setting to approach the ventilation access point Kira had identified from Resistance intelligence. Security systems have been partially disabled, she reported, after examining the entry point. Someone on the inside is helping them. Captain Gareth's skin patterns darkened with anger. Sacrilege upon sacrilege. They moved through the narrow maintenance tunnels in single file, Kira leading with detection equipment followed by 2 guards. Then Olathe, with George, close behind her, their bond now providing a tactical advantage as they could sense each other's positions without visual confirmation. Captain Gareth and the remaining guards brought up the rear. The ancestral retreat was primarily a vast underground complex carved into a mineral-rich mountainside. Ancient chambers connected by winding passages housed the memorials of generations of Vexaran royalty, their memories preserved in crystalline vessels that the living could commune with during sacred ceremonies. The central chamber would be the logical target, George whispered, as they paused at a junction. Maximum casualties, maximum symbolic impact. Kira shook her head. Scans show multiple devices. They're being thorough. The implications were disturbing. This wasn't a single assassin's work, but a coordinated operation requiring resources and inside knowledge. They split into two teams, Kira leading Garoth and two guards toward the central chamber, while George Alatha and the remaining guards headed for the memory archives, where the explosive signatures were strongest. As they separated, George felt a momentary spike of discomfort from the Thiassi bond, quickly suppressed, as both he and the princess adjusted to the increased distance. The memory archives were housed in a cavernous space, where thousands of crystal memory vessels lined the walls from floor to ceiling, each containing the preserved consciousness of a deceased Vexaran noble. The room's center was dominated by a circular platform, where communion with ancestors took place during ceremonies. And beneath that platform, partially concealed by ceremonial draping, was an explosive device of distinctly non-Vexaran design. Earth manufacture. George noted grimly as he carefully examined it without touching anything. Military grade but available on black markets throughout the quadrant. Alatha's skin patterns flashed with understanding. To implicate Earth in the attack. Creating a pretext to sever the alliance, George agreed. Clever. One of the guards began carefully documenting the device, while George continued his assessment. The trigger mechanism is set for remote detonation, rather than a timer. Someone wants to control exactly when this goes off. A sudden commotion from the corridor interrupted them, the sounds of energy weapons discharging followed by a body hitting the ground. George immediately pushed Alatha behind a memorial column, drawing his own weapon, as the remaining guard took up position at the chamber's opposite side. 3 figures entered the archives, 2 wearing the ceremonial robes of temple attendants, clearly disguises, and between them Prince Zuth himself. The prince froze at the sight of his sister and the human, his skin patterns cycling rapidly through shock anger and finally cold calculation. "Sister," he acknowledged with mock cordiality. "How inconvenient to find you here." "Brother," Alatha replied, stepping out from behind the column, despite George's attempt to keep her protected. "I wish I could say I'm surprised." Zeeth's companions raised their weapons, but the prince gestured for them to wait. "You've always had unfortunate timing, Alatha. Though I admit I'm curious how you discovered our little arrangement." His gaze shifted to George. "Perhaps your human pet brought more than just diplomatic platitudes." "Earth has nothing to do with this," George stated firmly, "though you clearly hope to implicate them." A thin smile spread across the prince's face. "Humans are useful scapegoats. Your species' reputation for aggression makes such deceptions easy to sell to the council." "Why Zuth?" Alatha demanded. "Our people are finally prospering through cooperation. Why throw us back into isolation?" "Cooperation." The prince spat the word. "Contamination is more accurate. Our sacred traditions diluted our sovereignty, compromised bit by bit with each new treaty." His skin patterns swirled with fervent conviction. "After tomorrow, when the royal family and council lie dead at human hands, the people will demand isolation. I will emerge as the sole survivor, the rightful king who will protect Vexara from alien influence." As he spoke, George noted the guard slowly shifting position for a clear shot. He needed to keep the prince talking. "You'd sacrifice your own family for power?" George asked, genuine disgust in his voice. Zth's attention turned fully, to him contempt evident. "You know nothing of our ways, human. The throne is not merely a position, it is a sacred responsibility to preserve our people's purity." He gestured dismissively. "Alatha would surrender our heritage for technological trinkets and false promises of brotherhood. I would lead our people forward," Alatha countered, "rather than strangling them with traditions that no longer serve their needs." The prince sneered. "Forward to what becoming a client state of human expansion, a curiosity for tourists, a source of resources for—" The distraction worked. The guard fired, striking one of Zuth's companions. George launched himself at the second attacker, while Alatha drew her own weapon and trained it on her brother. The brief, violent struggle ended with both disguised assassins neutralized, But Prince Zath had used the chaos to activate a personal shield device and was now backing toward the exit. "It changes nothing," he snarled. "The devices are already placed. The detonator is not here, and my loyalists will complete the task even without me." Garroth, Alatha, spoke into her communicator. "Status: 3 devices located and neutralized," came the captain's voice. "Kira is working on the 4th. We've captured 2 saboteurs." Zadhe's expression flickered with momentary uncertainty before hardening again. "Delays nothing more. The movement I've built will not die with this setback." Before either George or Alatha could respond, the chamber was suddenly flooded with royal security forces, led by an older Vexaran male, whose elaborate regalia identified him as the current monarch, King Thax, Alatha's father. "I believe I've heard enough," the king said coldly, his gaze fixed on his son. "Conspiracy, treason, attempted regicide. The ancestors weep at your betrayal, Zath." The prince's shield flickered as royal guards surrounded him, specialized weapons designed to penetrate such defenses, aimed at vital points. "Father," Zath acknowledged with grudging deference, "your timing is as impeccable as ever." "Not my timing," King Thax corrected. "I was alerted by Captain Garroth that the princess and her Thiazi bound had uncovered a plot against the royal family." His gaze shifted briefly to George, assessing. "It seems the human's presence has brought unexpected benefits." As the guards secured Prince Zath and began a thorough sweep of the ancestral retreat for any remaining explosives, George felt a strange sensation through the Thiazi bond, a surge of emotion from Alatha that was neither triumph nor relief, but something more complex. Looking at her, he saw her skin patterns displaying colors he hadn't witnessed before, shifting in patterns he couldn't interpret. The king approached his daughter, placing formal hands of blessing on her shoulders. "The succession ceremony must proceed as planned now more than ever. Our people need stability in the face of this treachery." He glanced at the captured prince. "And they must see justice done publicly." "Yes, father." Alatha agreed, her voice steady, despite the emotional turbulence George could sense through their bond. As they emerged from the ancestral retreat into the pre-dawn light, George found himself walking beside the princess, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The Thiazi bond hummed between them with new intensity after the shared danger. "The 3rd stage," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "Mutual protection and emotional confluence. It progresses faster than I expected." George nodded, acutely aware of the strange intimacy their bond had created. "What happens after the 3rd stage?" Alatha's skin pattern shifted to a color he hadn't seen before, something between anticipation and uncertainty. "The completion of Thiazi is different for each bonded pair. It will reveal itself when the time comes." The cryptic answer might have frustrated him weeks ago, but now he found himself accepting the Vexaran approach to their spiritual traditions. Some things couldn't be explained in briefing documents or rational terms, they had to be experienced. As they returned to the palace in the king's transport, George reflected on how thoroughly his perspective had shifted since arriving on Vixara. What had begun as a security advisor position, a rehabilitation assignment for a disgraced soldier, had become something far more significant. Through Thiazi, he had gained insight into not just Vexaran culture, but into himself, examining loyalties and principles he'd taken for granted. And as he glanced at Princess Alatha, whose determined expression couldn't hide the complex emotions flowing through their bond, he realized that whatever came next would transform them both. The royal succession ceremony was traditionally held once per stellar cycle, but the attempted bombing of the ancestral retreat and Prince Zath's treason had accelerated the timeline. 8 days after the thwarted attack, the Great Hall of Congregations was filled to capacity with Vexaran nobility, foreign dignitaries, and representatives from every province. George stood at the periphery of the royal dais, his position ambiguous, neither fully diplomat nor royal retainer, but something unique. The Thiazi bond placed him in unprecedented territory, a fact that continued to cause murmurs among the traditionalist factions despite the king's formal acknowledgement. Ambassador Hayes had been predictably concerned about the political implications when briefed on recent events. "You've become thoroughly entangled in Vexaran internal politics," he had observed during a private meeting. "Central Command is concerned about the appearance of Earth interference in their succession. With respect, sir, I prevented Earth from being framed for mass assassination," George had countered. "And the Thiassi bond has provided insights we couldn't have gained through conventional diplomacy." The ambassador hadn't seemed entirely convinced, but the alternative demanding George's return and potentially causing a diplomatic incident was clearly less appealing than maintaining the current arrangement. Now, as ceremonial chimes signaled the beginning of the succession proceedings, George found his attention drawn to Alatha, who stood resplendent in formal regalia that combined ancient symbols of royalty with subtle, modernist elements. Her skin patterns rippled with controlled emotion determination predominant, but underscored by anxiety that only George could perceive through their bond. King Thax entered to reverent silence, flanked by the High Council and Priestess Serona. Behind them, heavily guarded, came Prince Zeth, his royal insignia visibly damaged to symbolize his crimes, but not entirely removed. Vexaran tradition demanded that judgment be pronounced before a prince could be fully stripped of rank. The king ascended to the central platform and addressed the gathering in the formal tones of royal proclamation. He spoke of tradition and progress, of the challenges facing their world in an era of interstellar cooperation, and finally, of betrayal from within. "The succession cannot proceed while treachery remains unjudged," he declared, gesturing for Prince Zeth to be brought forward. "My son has conspired against the royal family, against our sacred traditions, and against the future of Vexara itself." Murmurs rippled through the assembly as the evidence was presented: recordings from the ancestral retreat, testimony from captured conspirators, and financial records showing Zeth's connection to radical isolationist groups. Through it all, the prince maintained a stony silence, his skin patterns locked in the static pattern of one who had retreated into ideological certainty. When the evidence presentation concluded, King Thax turned to his son. "What say you in your defense?" Zoth raised his head gaze, sweeping the assembly before settling on his sister. "I acted to preserve our people's soul from corruption. Future generations will recognize what this weak generation condemns. So you do not deny your actions?" "I claim them proudly," the prince declared. "And history will vindicate me when your misguided progress leads to subjugation." The king's skin patterns darkened with genuine sorrow. "Then, by ancient law and the judgment of the ancestors, you are stripped of royal standing and exiled from Vexara and all its territories. You will depart with only what you can carry to contemplate your betrayal among the stars." As royal guards moved to remove Zeth's remaining insignia, the prince suddenly lunged forward, producing a concealed ceremonial dagger, the same type used in the original assassination attempt against Alatha. The guards reacted instantly, but Zeth's position on the dais gave him a direct path to his sister. George was moving before conscious thought intervened, the Thiassi bond flaring with warning. He intercepted the prince's charge, deflecting the dagger thrust with a combat technique adapted for Vexaran anatomy. They grappled at the center of the dais, the assembly's shocked gasps creating a surreal backdrop to the life or death struggle. Zoth was stronger than his scholarly appearance suggested, driven by ideological fervor and desperation. The ceremonial dagger slashed dangerously close to George's throat before he managed to twist the prince's wrist, forcing him to drop the weapon. Even unarmed Zeth fought with the frenzy of someone with nothing to lose, landing several punishing blows before George could fully subdue him. By the time the guards reached them, George had pinned the prince face down, one arm locked behind his back, in a restraint technique modified for Vexaran physiology. As the guards secured, Zoth George became aware of Princess Alatha, standing nearby, not cowering as might be expected after an assassination attempt, but radiating authority. In her hand was a small device that George recognized as a recording unit. "The Assembly has witnessed my brother's true nature," she announced, her voice carrying throughout the hall. "And now, they will hear his true plans." She activated the device, and Zeeth's voice filled the chamber, a covert recording from the ancestral retreat, where he had outlined his intention to frame Earth for the royal family's assassination and seize power. The Assembly listened in stunned silence as the full scope of his treachery was laid bare. When the recording ended, King Thax stepped forward once more, his expression grave. "The judgment stands with the addition that the exile is permanent and absolute. Zeph is no longer my son, no longer of royal blood, no longer Vexarin." The pronouncement, the most severe possible under their law, sent visible shock through the Assembly. To be declared non-Vexarin was to be erased from history, from family records, from the very possibility of joining the ancestors after death. It was spiritual execution. As the disgraced prince was led away, his final venomous glare focused not on his father or sister, but on George the human, whose presence had accelerated the modernization he despised, and whose bond with Alatha symbolized everything he had fought against. The ceremony paused briefly, as the Assembly absorbed these dramatic events, then proceeded with renewed solemnity. King Thax turned to Princess Alatha, who knelt before him in the traditional posture of succession. "The first daughter has proven her worth through wisdom, courage, and devotion to our people's true welfare," the king proclaimed. "I name Alatha as my successor to be crowned upon my passage to the ancestors." The Assembly erupted in approval, not merely the formal acknowledgement protocol demanded, but genuine enthusiasm, particularly from the younger nobles and provincial representatives who had championed modernization. As Alatha rose now officially, crown princess and heir apparent, her gaze found George's across the dais. Through their bond flowed such a complex mixture of emotions that he couldn't have named them all: triumph, relief, gratitude, and something deeper that made his breath catch. Priestess Sirona approached them as the formal portions of the ceremony transitioned to celebratory rituals. "The third stage is complete," she announced quietly. "The completion of Thiassi awaits only your acceptance." "What does that entail?" George asked, still somewhat wary of the deliberate vagueness that seemed to surround the final stage. The priestess's skin pattern shifted in what he had come to recognize as the Vexarin equivalent of a knowing smile. "The Thiassi bond has evolved beyond duty or circumstance. It now requires formal recognition of what it has become." Before George could press for clarification, King Thax summoned the Assembly's attention once more. "Today marks not only the confirmation of succession, but a new chapter in Vexarin history," he announced. "The Thiassi bond between Crown Princess Alatha and human George Sullivan has demonstrated its sacred power through mutual protection and sacrifice." Murmurs spread through the gathering as the king continued. "The High Council has convened, and with the guidance of Priestess Sirona, has determined that this bond transcends ordinary Thiassi. It represents a spiritual union between our peoples that must be formally recognized." George felt a sudden understanding dawn through the bond. Alatha had known this was coming. She stood beside her father, her skin patterns displaying the formal royal composure that hid her true emotions from all but him. "Therefore," King Thax concluded, "upon completion of the Thiassi ritual, George Sullivan will be recognized as royal consort, the first human to hold such status in our history." The announcement sent ripples of astonishment through the Assembly. George himself stood momentarily frozen, processing the implications. Royal consort, effectively husband to the future queen. Ambassador Hayes, present as Earth's representative, looked as though he might faint from the diplomatic implications. George caught his gaze across the chamber and gave a slight nod of reassurance. This wasn't a political ambush, but the natural culmination of a bond that had developed organically. As the ceremony concluded, and the Assembly dispersed for the traditional celebration feast, George found himself momentarily alone with Alatha in a small antechamber off the main hall. You knew, he said simply. She nodded her royal composure, giving way to the more genuine expressions he'd come to know through their bond. I suspected since the truth-sharing. Thiassi rarely progresses so rapidly or deeply, unless it is meant to become permanent. You might have warned me that I was effectively courting the future queen. A smile touched her lips. Would you have approached it differently if you had known? George considered the question, honestly reflecting on the progression of their bond from reluctant proximity to mutual understanding to the profound connection they now shared. No, he finally admitted. But the diplomatic complications can be navigated, she finished for him. Your ambassador appears concerned but not opposed, and my father's support removes the most significant internal obstacles. What about your people? Will they accept a human consort? Olatha's skin patterns shifted to show determination. Those who support modernization already celebrate the symbolism. The traditionalists, she shrugged slightly. They would have objected to any choice I made, but they cannot deny the sacred nature of the SI, especially after you have twice saved my life before witnesses. George nodded slowly, accepting the political reality. But there was a more personal question that needed asking. And what about you, Olatha? Is this what you want, or merely what Thiassi demands? Her expression softened, and through their bond flowed an emotion that needed no translation across species barriers. Thiassi creates the connection, George, but it does not create feelings that aren't already possible. What I feel? She paused, searching for words. It began as duty, yes, but it has become choice. She stepped closer, placing her hand against his chest in a gesture that held ritual significance in Vexaran culture, acclaiming an acknowledgement, an offering. The question, she said softly, is whether you can accept what completion means. You would be bound not just to me, but to my world, my duties, my future. George covered her hand with his own, feeling the now familiar resonance of their bond humming between them. I was adrift before I came here, he admitted. Discharged from the only life I knew, assigned to a diplomatic post I didn't want. He met her gaze directly. Through Thiassi, I've found purpose again, not just in protecting you, but in building something meaningful between our peoples. The corner of her mouth lifted in a smile. That sounds suspiciously like acceptance, Human Sullivan. It is, he confirmed, returning the smile. Though I should warn you, I have absolutely no idea how to be a royal consort. Fortunately, she replied, her skin patterns displaying genuine amusement. There is no precedent for a human consort, so you cannot fail at upholding traditions that don't yet exist. Their moment of privacy was interrupted by Priestess Sirona, who entered with ceremonial timing that suggested she had been waiting for precisely this conversation to conclude. The king awaits your decision regarding the completion ritual, she informed them. It must be performed before the 3 moons align if it is to receive the ancestors' fullest blessing. George looked to Alatha, who nodded almost imperceptibly. We have reached agreement, he told the priestess. We will proceed with the completion. Sirona's skin patterns displayed formal satisfaction. Then it shall be prepared for tomorrow's dawn. She bowed respectfully and departed, leaving them alone once more. Tomorrow, Olatha mused. My father moves quickly to secure the succession and alliance. Political pragmatism, George asked. That and... She hesitated. He is not well, though few know it. The succession may come sooner than publicly acknowledged. George absorbed this information, understanding its weight. All the more reason to establish stability. She nodded, then straightened her posture, resuming the royal bearing required for their return to the public celebration. Tonight, we maintain diplomatic formalities. Tomorrow, we complete what began with a blade meant for my heart. And then, George asked. Olatha's skin patterns shifted to display a complex emotion that even their bond couldn't fully translate, something like hope, blended with determination and a touch of wonder. And then, she said, we begin the work of truly uniting our peoples. The completion ritual took place in the Chamber of Concordance, an ancient space deep within the royal palace that had historically been used for the most sacred ceremonies of Vexaran tradition. As dawn broke over Vixara, its 3 moons still visible in the fading night sky, George and Alatha stood at the center of a circular platform surrounded by concentric rings of luminescent stone. They wore ceremonial attire that blended Vexaran and human elements. George, in a formal uniform bearing both earth insignia and newly created symbols, representing his unique position, Alatha in royal regalia that incorporated subtle geometries reminiscent of human design. The symbolism was carefully calculated to represent the unprecedented nature of their union. King Thax and Priestess Sirona presided over the ceremony, with only Captain Gareth Ambassador Hayes and a small number of essential witnesses in attendance. The completion of Thiassi was traditionally intimate, its power derived not from public spectacle, but from the focused intention of those involved. "The blood debt has evolved," Priestess Sirona intoned, beginning the formal recitation. "From sacrifice freely given and gratefully received, a bond has formed that transcends obligation. Proximity has aligned your physical essences. Truth has aligned your spiritual essences. Protection has aligned your purpose." As she spoke, attendants activated ancient mechanisms within the chamber. The concentric rings began to rotate slowly in alternating directions, creating a hypnotic effect enhanced by the changing patterns of light. Now remains only the final alignment, the willing and conscious acceptance of the permanent bond. Sirona continued presenting an ornate, ceremonial blade. "What began with blood must be sealed with blood freely given." George had been briefed on this aspect of the ritual, a symbolic reopening of the original wound that had initiated Thiassi, matched by a corresponding wound from Alatha. The blood mingling would represent the final merging of their separate paths into a single, shared journey. Sirona held the blade first to Alatha, who accepted it with formal precision. Without hesitation, she drew it across her palm, creating a shallow cut that welled with the iridescent blood, characteristic of Vexaran physiology. She then handed the blade to George, their eyes meeting in silent communication that went deeper than words. George mirrored her action, drawing the blade across his own palm. The sting was minimal compared to the original injury that had started their bond, but its symbolic weight felt momentous. He extended his bleeding hand toward hers, and their palms met in the center of the rotating platform. The instant their blood mingled, the Thiassi bond flared with unprecedented intensity. George had expected a symbolic gesture, perhaps a ceremonial sensation. What occurred instead defied rational explanation. The chamber seemed to fall away as their consciousnesses partially merged, creating a shared perspective, unlike anything he had experienced. He could feel Alatha's presence, not as a separate entity connected to him, but as an extension of his own awareness. Memories flowed between them, her childhood in the palace, his missions in distant conflict zones, their separate paths that had converged in that fateful moment when he intercepted the assassin's blade. Simultaneously, he became aware of other presences distant, yet distinct, observing their union with ancient awareness. The ancestors, he realized with sudden understanding. Through Alatha's royal bloodline, the collected consciousness of generations of Vexaran rulers were witnessing, and in some inexplicable way blessing their bond. How long the experience lasted, George couldn't have said. When awareness of the physical world returned, he found himself still standing on the platform, hands still joined with Alatha's. But something fundamental had changed. The Thiassi bond had transformed from an external connection between them to a permanent aspect of their shared existence. "It is done," Priestess Sirona announced, though the words seemed redundant to those who had experienced the bond's completion. "The ancestors have witnessed and accepted. 2 paths are now one." King Thax stepped forward, his ceremonial staff, striking the platform 3 times in ancient tradition. "Before the ancestors and these witnesses, I recognize the completion of Thiassi, between Crown Princess Alatha and human George Sullivan." Henceforth he shall be known as royal consort and true bonded. The limited assembly responded with the formal acknowledgement, though Ambassador Hayes looked somewhat shell-shocked by the intensity of the ritual he had just witnessed, a diplomatic report that would undoubtedly make interesting reading at Earth Central Command. As the ceremony concluded, and they moved to the more public announcement that would follow, George found himself in a strange state of clarity. The confusion and uncertainty that had accompanied his initial entanglement in Vexaran politics had been replaced by a profound sense of purpose. Through the bond, he could sense Alatha experiencing a similar resolution, the weight of succession now balanced by their shared strength. The public proclamation took place in the Grand Courtyard, where representatives from all Vexaran provinces and allied worlds had gathered. As George stood beside Alatha, while King Thax formalized their union and his status as royal consort, he reflected on the improbable journey that had brought him here. A disgraced soldier seeking redemption had become a living bridge between two species, bound through ancient tradition, to the future queen of a civilization that had once been merely an interesting entry in diplomatic briefings. And somewhere in the process, he had found not just purpose, but belonging. As they proceeded through the formal celebrations that followed, accepting congratulations from Vexaran nobles and off-world diplomats alike, George caught sight of Captain Garoth, observing from a respectful distance. The once suspicious guard captain offered a formal gesture of respect, not the perfunctory acknowledgement of protocol, but the deeper recognition granted to one whose loyalty had been proven beyond question. Ambassador Hayes approached during a brief lull in the proceedings, his diplomatic composure restored, but with visible amazement still evident in his expression. "Congratulations, Sullivan," he offered carefully. "Or should I say, Your Highness now?" "George is still fine, sir," he replied with a slight smile. "At least in private conversations." The ambassador nodded, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Central Command is processing the implications. This goes well beyond our standard diplomatic protocols." "I imagine so. They're concerned about divided loyalties." Hayes continued more directly than George had expected. "You're still technically an Earth citizen in service to our diplomatic corps. And now I'm Thesi bonded to the Crown Princess of Vexara," George acknowledged. "The potential for conflict of interest isn't lost on me, sir." Hayes studied him for a moment. "What would you do if such a conflict arose? If Vexaran interests and Earth interests diverged significantly?" It was a fair question, one George had contemplated during the days leading to the completion ritual. Through the bond, he sensed Alatha's awareness of their conversation, though she remained engaged with her own diplomatic discussions across the courtyard. "I believe my unique position gives me the responsibility to prevent such conflicts before they develop," he answered carefully. "But if forced to choose—" He paused, considering his words. "I would choose the path that best serves the alliance between our peoples, not the temporary advantage of either side." The ambassador seemed to weigh this answer, then nodded slowly. "A diplomatic response worthy of your new position." His expression softened slightly. "For what it's worth, Sullivan, I think you may have stumbled into something more significant than either government fully realizes yet. This bond, this Thiasi, it creates possibilities we hadn't considered in our approach to interspecies relations." "It does," George agreed, "though I wouldn't recommend assassination attempts as a standard diplomatic technique." Hayes actually chuckled at that. "No, I don't imagine Central Command will be adding jump in front of blades meant for alien royalty to our training protocols." He glanced toward Alatha, who was now approaching them. "But the results in this case seem promising." As the princess joined them, exchanging formal greetings with the ambassador, George felt the full weight of what had been set in motion. Their bond represented not just a personal connection, but a fundamental shift in relations between their species, living proof that the barriers between human and alien could be bridged in ways deeper than mere political alliance. The celebrations continued into the evening, transitioning from formal ceremony to more relaxed festivities that incorporated both Vexaran traditions and elements of Earth culture, a symbolic merging that mirrored their own union. As dusk fell over Vixara, the three moons rose in perfect alignment, casting prismatic light across the city's crystalline architecture. Standing on a private balcony overlooking the celebration, George and Alatha shared a rare moment away from diplomatic demands. Through their completed bond, words seemed almost redundant, each aware of the other's thoughts and feelings, with an intimacy that transcended conventional communication. "Your ambassador seems concerned about your changing loyalties." Alatha observed, her tone light, despite the serious subject. "Your father seems concerned about your choice of consort," George countered with equal lightness. She smiled, her skin patterns displaying genuine amusement. "They'll adapt. Both our peoples will adapt. And if they don't—" Alatha turned to face him fully, her expression resolute. "Then we will show them the way. What we've forged between us isn't just personal, it's a template for what's possible." Her skin patterns shifted to display determination, tinged with hope. Thiasi between different species was thought impossible before now. What other impossibilities might we challenge? George considered this, feeling the weight of potential in her words. Their bond had already transformed his understanding of what connection could mean, not just politically or diplomatically, but on a fundamental level that crossed the boundaries of species culture and biology. "We'll find out together," he said, simply knowing she could feel the depth of commitment behind the words. As night deepened over Vixara and the celebrations below continued, they remained on the balcony, their silhouettes visible against the prismatic moonlight. Human and Vexaran separate in form, but united in purpose. The first of what both hoped would become a new form of understanding between their worlds. In the grand narrative of interspecies relations, they were but a single chapter, yet one that had begun with a split-second decision to intercept a blade, and had culminated in a bond that promised to reshape the future of both their peoples. A life debt had become a life shared, transcending the ancient traditions that had initiated it, while simultaneously fulfilling their deepest purpose. And as the three moons of Vexara aligned in their ancient dance across the night sky, casting their light upon the new path that had been forged, both George and Alatha understood that their story was just beginning.